Welcome to another episode of Walking the Path of Grief. I'm Di Atherton. I am a certified death doula and grief guide, and I work with people who are navigating the path of grief, facing crossroads after loss, and I have a passion for normalizing death and dying and helping people to understand that there is so much more to grief than we realize and how misunderstood it is. And grief is such a small word, and yet it's such an innocuous word. And behind it is such an enormous space of often emotional struggle, very often because we don't understand the nature of grief. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about the loss of someone, the death of someone. And because we don't want to talk about it and we don't want to hear about it, and I get told that often, it's like, oh, what you do is so morbid. Like, how can you work with such a morbid subject? Well, it may be morbid to some, but it is a natural part of life. It is, everything is born and everything dies on our planet. That's the way it works. And the more we understand and educate ourselves, the better prepared we can be when it happens to us. And happen to us, it will. And today I want to talk about the different kinds of grief that you can get, the different layers of grief. The first one is collective grief. And collective grief is what happens when there is a huge loss or natural disaster or catastrophe. It could be in your community, in your town, the country you live in, or even across the world. When it is suffering or disaster on a large scale, we can feel it even if we're not directly involved and it doesn't impact us in any way whatsoever. And I'll give you an example. At the beginning of this year in South Africa, just as the schools reopened after the long summer holidays, there was a horrific taxi accident in another part of the country, and 14 school children, young school children, died in the accident. That hit the country collectively. There were heart-rending photos of mothers collapsed at the side of the road. It was just absolutely heartbreaking. And everybody was feeling it. You know, as the news spread, and you know that with social media, like nothing is hidden any longer. In the olden days, that kind of news could have taken 6 months to reach us. Now it's instant, and the people at the scene are taking photos and videos, and they're not at all shy about sharing those on social media. That impacts us. It impacts us emotionally, and sometimes we don't even realize that it is collective grief that we're feeling. We just know we feel heavy, we feel sad, we feel depressed, but there's no reason in our own lives why we should be feeling like that. And that is often because we are experiencing collective grief. I know the town that I live in, White River, is a fairly small town, and there have been deaths over the years of people, well-known people in the community, much loved people in the community. And it really impacts the town. You can feel it when you go out, when you go into the shops. There's like this subdued air, and people are, they're just really quiet, and everyone's sort of shocked. And you really, really feel the impact of it, because collective grief is an energetic thing that we feel anyway. It's emotions on a huge scale that our bodies are trying to deal with. We're trying to get our heads around, and we feel it when it's collective grief. And then you have, that's collective grief. Then you have anticipatory grief. And anticipatory grief you often experience when someone or a family is caring for a loved one, for example, who is terminal, or it's simply someone that you know is reaching the end of life. And there are ways of identifying when someone is approaching the act of dying process, and it's something I'll talk about in a later episode. But very often when you're caring for someone who's terminally ill, you can veer between hope and despair, and anticipatory grief becomes part of it because you know that their life is coming to an end. So every moment that you are with them, every morning when you wake up, you're very, very conscious that they're going to be gone soon. And your body's trying to cope with that in advance. Or, for example, like, because it's not grief, the thing is, grief is not just related to the physical death of someone. It can relate to so many different things. So a business is failing. Something is closing down. Something is coming to an end. There is grief around what is coming, the event that is coming, the moment that's going to happen. We're already thinking about it, and we're sad that it's going to happen. We're grieving. Very often with, families who the children are immigrating overseas, there's deep grief on the part of the parents. Although they're happy that their children are spreading their wings and it's new opportunities, and they know in their hearts it's going to be so much better for them, there's still that grief that their family is fragmenting and their children are going across the ocean and they don't know when they'll see them again. So there's that, as the days pass and the date of departure gets closer and closer, there is that anticipatory grief that is present, and that we need to be aware of. And then you have secondary grief. And secondary grief is the losses that you experience as a result of a main loss. So, for example, a husband dies, and the wife can experience many different losses besides the loss of her husband. It can be financial, if he died and his financial affairs weren't in order, or there was no policies, no insurance policies on his life, there's no money, she doesn't know where anything is, so she experiences the loss of financial security. Can be the loss of a home, can be anything relating to the life that you had with that person, and loss of identity. And that's something that I have not struggled with, but I've been very aware of. In June this year, it's 7 years since my husband died. And we were together for 38 years. If you listen to episode 1, I share a bit of my story. And that is what brought me on this path of grief work and death doula. But what I've realized over 7 years is I had lost a lot of my own identity. And it was like, who am I if I'm not John's wife? Because we were very close. We did a lot of things together. I worked in his business. I ran his office, ran all the admin, ran all the finances. Who am I without that? And a lot of my journey, especially over the last few years, has been like, who am I on my own? Not as John Atherton's wife, but just as Di Atherton. So that secondary grief very often shows up because of a main loss. So you lose your business fails or closes down. So all of that was attached to you and your identity and the business is now gone. It's like a vacuum. And you are mourning the loss of what was. And that is known as secondary grief. It's not the main thing that causes you to grieve. It's all the little things around it that you lose. And very often we don't realize it, but that grief, that secondary grief, can be around the loss of rituals and habits. You know, I know for me particularly, and I often share this story, like we had a habit that on Sunday morning, John would go to Mass, good Catholic, go off to Mass at 8 a.m. And then when he came home, he would give me breakfast in bed. He would make coffee. It was the only cup of coffee I ever drank, 1 cup a day, just to keep him happy. In his little Bialetti, it was a whole production downstairs. And then he would come with toast and coffee. And I still miss that. In fact, I'll often lie in bed on a Sunday and go like, where are you? Because I want my breakfast in bed. And I miss that. I grieve the loss of all the little habits and rituals that he and I had created over 38 years. Even though I'm very happy with the life that I have built for myself, there's still that sense of loss and missing at what we had. So that is your secondary grief. And then the last kind of grief that you can get is disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief can often be around losses that other people just don't understand. One of the biggest is pet loss. You know, for many people, it's just a dog, it's just a cat, or it's just a parrot or a budgie. But if you're someone like me, my 2 dogs, Charlie and Fergus, and Coco the cat, they are my fur babies. Like, I don't know where I would have been the last 7 years without them in my life. They've been my constant companions. They've been there, you know, in my darkest times. And both Charlie and Fergus are getting old. They do have health issues now. And there's, you know, every day, every night, I thank them both for another day. But in my heart, I'm already sitting with anticipatory grief because I know what's coming and I know it's going to hit me hard. So I'm aware of it. I don't dwell on it, but I'm aware of it. But for someone else, they're like, oh, it's a dog. Like, what's the big deal? And, you know, this is one of the problems with compassionate leave. And I know in a lot of countries, they're trying to change it, that when people lose a beloved pet, and I know that some of you who listen to this will absolutely identify, like, your pets are your everything. So pets, also miscarriage and infertility. Again, you know, people go, well, what's the big deal? Like, there wasn't even a baby. Like, why are you making such a big thing about this? But for the person who was carrying that embryo or has been trying endlessly to have a child, it's a loss for them, and they feel it deeply. If they are wanting a baby so much, those kind of losses have an enormous impact on them emotionally. But for many people, it's like, well, what's the big deal? And it kind of gets like brushed off. And again, in compassionate leave, although I know in the UK, they're making big strides in changing the law around that. But, you know, for a woman, it's a huge thing to feel like you failed because you weren't able, you weren't able to fall pregnant or you miscarried. And there's a huge amount of grief around that. You can also get disenfranchised grief with like ex-partners. A couple's got divorced or they broke up and one of them dies. The other person can still grieve that person because at some point there was a connection. And if the couple had children, that connection is always there. So unless they were mortal enemies, it's highly likely that that person, the partner who's left behind, will be feeling grief because that person, the person they were with has died, even if they hadn't been in contact for years. you can still grieve it. And then it's the same at work. You know, there may be a colleague, you didn't particularly like them, you never really had anything to do with them, but you hear that they have died and you feel sad. Is that, you know, and people are like, but you didn't even like the person. Why are you sad? Because someone has died. Like, someone's life has ended. It doesn't matter what you thought about them, it's still that someone isn't around any longer. You know, it can be an estranged family member. Just because you're estranged and you haven't spoken to each other for years, don't think that you don't have a connection with them. So don't be surprised if in any of these situations you start to feel sad, or you're feeling sad and heavy and down and maybe even weepy and you don't know why. Have a think about what's been happening around you. Have there been any losses around you? Because if there have, then you may well be experiencing one of those kinds of grief. Collective grief, if it's been a big event somewhere, and as I say, it can be on the other side of the world. And when you see, you know, if there's been a natural disaster like an earthquake or a tsunami or a tornado, a landslide, and people are killed, and you see all these gut-wrenching photos, you will probably feel something. You may feel helpless, you may feel emotional, sad. Allow yourself to feel those feelings. They're not irrational and they're not unreasonable. And then your anticipatory grief and your secondary grief, and then your disenfranchised grief. Those are the 4 different kinds of grief you can experience. And again, just allow yourself to feel what you need to feel. You be in that womb space of grief. I don't know for how long. That's the thing with all of this. There's no time frame. So you might feel sad for a day or 2 and just like, I'm sad. Or you might decide you want to, if it's a collective grief thing, if there has been a terrible tragedy or catastrophe somewhere, you might want to light a candle and just say a little prayer, or whatever works for you. Rituals can be very comforting. And it's taking the time to be with yourself and be with your body and go, what is it that I'm feeling? I'm feeling sad. I've been weepy all day. Is this mine? And you'll feel, there's nothing in my life that warrants me feeling like that. And then you just take your awareness a little bit further out. What else has been going on? You know, it can be something as simple as a friend of yours is going through a lot of struggle and heartache. So you may be feeling that anticipatory grief because you know that her struggle is going to continue, or her loved one is going to pass, and you know that she's really battling with this. Because that is, as human beings, we are so connected to each other. And we don't realize it. We pick up all the time. We're picking up emotions and feelings, and we can feel them ourselves and then wonder why we're feeling like this, but it's not actually our stuff. So just be aware. When you start to feel those heavy feelings, why do I feel so sad? You could be experiencing one of those kinds of grief. Because grief isn't just one emotion, and it's not just one thing. It's multi-layered and it's complex. And the more we can understand it, the better able we are to manage it when it does show up in our lives. Would love to hear from you, your experiences. And if you have any questions or there's any topics you would like me to cover around grief or death and dying, just please drop a comment, subscribe to my YouTube channel, give me a follow. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, Di Atherton, and I'll see you soon.